Let's take a good look at Genesis chapter 25, which I've called Father Abraham Had Many Sons. There was this tough old Scotsman. He told his grandson that if he wanted to live a long life, the secret was to sprinkle a pinch of gunpowder on his porridge every morning. And the grandson did this religiously until the age of 103. And when he died, he left behind him 14 children, 30 great-grandchildren, 45 great-grandchildren, 25 great-great-grandchildren, and a 15-foot hole where the crematorium used to be. Now, given the challenges and the trials of Abraham's life, he might have been fooled into thinking that God only sprinkled his blessing on him from time to time. And that's how life might seem to us as well. I know we sing showers of blessing we need, mercy drops round us are falling, but for the showers we plead. And that's okay if we're praying for revival and spiritual refreshment. However, we need to make sure we've got our theology right, because the reality is that God's blessing on Abraham's life did not come in sprinkles or raindrops, but was an abundant outpouring of God's grace on his entire life, whether he was conscious of this or not. And it's exactly the same with you and me if we happen to be Abraham's great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren. And I might have missed out a few greats there. Anyway, Abraham lived a long life. And when he died, he was not cremated, but buried. And as Genesis 25 shows us, he left behind numerous sons and doubtless many unnamed daughters, resulting in multitudinous grandchildren and great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren and on and on. First of all then, this chapter is telling us that Abraham is the father of many nations. We've come to the end of our series on the Abrahamic narratives, and we've come to the end of Abraham's life. And so it's time now to ask ourselves, isn't it? Now, what legacy does Abraham leave? Well, Muslims have their own idea about this, and we can read about that in the second surah of the Quran, which is called Baqarah, or the cow. And there Allah promises Abraham, I will make you an imam, or Islamic leader, to the nations. That's in ayat 124, or verse 124. And in other words, someone who calls upon the nations to submit to the will of Allah. And we're told that Abraham prayed that Allah would produce imams or Islamic leaders from his offspring, those who, like him, would call upon people to submit to the will of Allah. And having built the original mosque in Mecca, Abraham next prays that Allah would make Ishmael and himself good Muslims, and from their descendants produce a good Muslim nation. And so in Islam, or the Quran, the legacy Abraham leaves to his sons is that of submitting to the will of Allah. Indeed, the word Islam means submission, and a Muslim is one who submits. Now, God does promise to produce leaders through Abraham, but not imams. Kings will come from you, we read in Genesis chapter 17 and verse 6, and ultimately, of course, our King of Kings. Without any external evidence, the Quran retells the story of Abraham, but while stumbling around in the darkness of historical ignorance, has the Quran actually hit the nail on the head in claiming that Abraham's legacy is that of modelling submission to God's will and teaching others to do likewise? Well, I'll let that question hang in the air. As Arnie would say, I'll be back. One smart aleck remarked, my father was a seismologist. He could never get a steady job. Well, our father Abraham didn't study earthquakes. Indeed, he caused the whole earth to shake. Now, true, it took time for the tectonic plates to grind together, but the tectonic plates began to move when God confirmed his covenant with Abraham, as is recorded for us in Genesis 17. And there God said, as for me, this is my covenant with you. You will be the father of many nations. No longer will you be called Abraham, father. Your name will be Abraham, father of many. For I have made you a father of many nations. I will make you very fruitful. I will make nations of you, and kings will come from you. And so we feel the first tremors as we read the opening verses of Genesis 25. Because from Abraham we now see nations coming into being. Through Sarah, Abraham is the father of one great nation, Israel, but through Keturah, he is the father of many nations emanating from the 6 sons produced through this second marriage. And presumably the nations emanating from Jokshan and Midian are singled out as being particularly familiar to later Jewish readers. Of course, the word nation, as we've seen, does not correspond to our modern nation states. These nations are just simply people groups under common rule or leadership, and many of them are what we would call tribes. Now, why did God bring into being so many other people groups through Abraham? I mean, why isn't there an exclusive focus on the great nation, which initially became identifiable with the nation of Israel? Because Israel must never claim to have exclusive rights to Abraham. If we think of the migration patterns and intermarriage over thousands of years, we conclude that immense numbers of the world's people are physically descended from Abraham through Ishmael, through his second wife Keturah, and the sons of his concubines. Any attempts by Jews to exclusively claim Abraham as their own is further relativized by New Testament teaching. I mean, at the end of the day, it is spiritual descent, not physical descent from Abraham, that really matters. And that's what we read in Romans 4. Therefore, the promise comes by faith, so that it may be by grace, and may be guaranteed to all Abraham's offspring, not only to those who are of the law, but also to those who have the faith of Abraham. He is the father of us all, as it is written, I have made you a father of many nations. So that's the fulfillment of that promise. So I mean, that takes us back, doesn't it, to a key text in the Abrahamic narratives, one which is made a great deal of in the New Testament. And I'm referring here, of course, to Genesis chapter 15, verse 6, where we read, Abraham believed the Lord, and he credited to him as righteousness. So what is our Creator looking for in you and me as his creatures that would cause him to consider us in a right relationship with himself? He's looking for us to believe in him, to trust and depend on him. The Islamic understanding of what it means to have a right relationship with God is tragic. It completely underestimates the depth of our depravity. If our salvation depends upon submission to God's will, we are doomed. Because you might remember that God's promises to Abraham, as we read them in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 3, it presupposes that such is the depth of human depravity that all people are under a curse which ends in death. That's Genesis 3 to 11. And so after the flood judgment, God said, never again will I curse the ground because of man, even though every inclination of his heart is evil from childhood. What a wonderful thing it is to trust in Jesus and what he accomplished on the cross and experience God's forgiveness and his life-transforming blessing and grace. So modelling a life of faith obedience as the right way for a human creature to respond to his or her Creator is the greatest legacy that Abraham has bequeathed to you and me. So the nations emanating from the physical descendants of Abraham, as mentioned in Genesis 25, now serve as a symbol of all true descendants of Abraham by faith. And so we can add our voices to those of our children as we sing the version, Father Abraham had many sons, as modified by Colin Buchanan. You know, Father Abraham had many kids. Many kids had Father Abraham. I am one of them, and so are you, through faith in Jesus Christ. I think that's a better modification of the words. So we thought about Abraham as the father of many nations, but the second thing that's brought out in verses 5 to 6 is that Abraham is the father of the great nation, because we read there that Abraham left everything he owned to Isaac. But while he was still living, he gave gifts to the sons of his concubines and sent them away from his son Isaac to the land of the east. Now God's promise to make Abraham the father of many nations is now offset, isn't it, against the initial great promise that God made Abraham, I will make you into a great nation. That's why now there's an exclusive focus on Isaac, and you're removing the other sons from the scene, the photo as it were. So Genesis 25, it's contrasting Abraham as the father of many nations, with Abraham as the father of the great nation. So the recognition of Abraham as the father of many nations cautions against exaggerating the importance of the great nation. But let's not go to the other extreme. Yes, every follower of Christ, whether Jew or non-Jew, can look back to Abraham as their ancestor. But let's not think that being a Jew is now of little importance. That's not true. Why was God committed to the great nation which historically came to be identified with the Jewish people? Well, so that through them God's blessing would be mediated to all nations. And that is precisely what has happened. What did Jesus say to the Samaritan woman? You Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews. But might not God have reasoned that because of their persistent idolatry and rebellion, the Jewish people had forfeited their right to be the conduit that he would use to bless the world? I mean, why didn't he cause a Chinese or a Peruvian woman to have a virgin birth? Why not in this way enter the world as the Word made flesh? Well, at the end of the day, it makes no difference, does it, which people group God uses as medium or agency to bless all peoples? Because as Paul points out in Romans chapters 1 to 3, we are all, whether we're Jew or non-Jew, just as incorrigibly idolatrous and sinful as one another. And so Jesus the Jew calls Jewish disciples to himself, and he constitutes them a new and a true Israel. And Jesus himself is the embodiment of everything a true son of Abraham, a true Jew, should be, and he calls his followers to live likewise. The early church was first and foremost a Jewish church. And it's a plain fact of history that salvation has come to us non-Jews through Jewish people. And so we owe the Jews a huge debt. God has not given up on the Jewish people as a people. And Paul deals with this in Romans chapter 11. He is insistent that God has not rejected his people, that is, the Jewish people. And he teaches in verse 11 that salvation has come to the Gentiles to make Israel envious. He tells us, I do not want you to be ignorant of this mystery, brothers, so that you may not be conceited. Israel has experienced a hardening in part until the full number of the Gentiles has come in. And so all Israel will be saved. It's a mystery, he tells us, so I myself don't know precisely what Paul means here, but we must avoid crazy dispensationalist thinking. We don't pin hopes on a revival of the Jewish theocratic state, or on the rebuilding of the Jewish temple, or any of that kind of nonsense. Paul is not encouraging Zionism or any kind of political siding with the Jewish nation, for example, against the Palestinians. Political Israel has indeed been guilty of gross violations of human rights. Just think of Israel's lamentable treatment of desperate Christian refugees from Eritrea who have sought refuge in Israel. Now, when Paul thinks about the future for Israel, he is not thinking politically, but simply of the Jewish people experiencing the same salvation that you and I now enjoy in Christ. Paul has in mind the hardening of the Jewish people as a people, and he indicates that after the full number of the Gentiles has come in, there'll be some change in this hardening of the Jewish people as a people. So Paul seems to expect a time when salvation will be experienced to a significant degree by the Jewish people as a people. So let's avoid thinking that all that matters is the reaching of individual Jews with the gospel. Paul, a Jew himself, said, brothers, my heart's desire and prayer to God for the Israelites is that they may be saved. And given our immense debt to the Jewish people, I think it's a great pity that it's not more standard for our churches to pray for salvation to come to the Jewish people as a people, while avoiding getting caught up in political matters. We come now to look at the death of Abraham. So coming back to Genesis chapter 25, we next read that altogether Abraham lived 175 years. That's a pretty good innings, isn't it? And then Abraham breathed his last, and he died at a good old age, an old man and full of years, and he was gathered to his people. Now the image here is that of a man who has lived a good and fulfilling life. And this fulfills another promise that God made to Abraham, as recorded in Genesis chapter 15 and verse 15, where God said to him, "You, however, will go to your fathers in peace and be buried at a good old age." Now, in the context, God was promising Abraham that he himself would not experience the enslavement and the mistreatment that lay ahead for his descendants. And to say that Abraham will go to his fathers in peace may simply mean that at the time of his death he will be experiencing peace, that is shalom. And the word shalom suggests wholeness, completeness, fulfillment. However, it's also possible that when it says Abraham will go to his fathers in peace, that it means that in the afterlife Abraham will experience shalom, wholeness, completeness, fulfillment. It is striking that God promised King Josiah that he would be gathered to his fathers and buried in peace. You'll read about that in 2 Chronicles 34. But we know, if we read the very next chapter after that, that Josiah died from mortal wounds that he received in battle, which may indicate that his experience of shalom was in the afterlife. "Do you believe in life after death?" a boss asked one of his employees. "Yes, sir," the employee replied. "Well, then that makes everything just fine," the boss went on. "After you left early yesterday to go to your grandmother's funeral, she stopped in to see you." Now, is Genesis 25 speaking about life after death when it says that Abraham was gathered to his people? Well, there are three main scholarly opinions about this phrase. First of all, that it expresses a belief in immortality. There's many scholars who do believe that. It does. Or second, is it just a euphemism for death? Or thirdly, does it indicate the practice of actually burying people with their ancestors? Well, I think we can eliminate option 3 straight away. I mean, when it says he was gathered to his people, it's plainly in Genesis 25 before Abraham's burial. And indeed, even when he is buried, he's not buried with his people, but as verse 10 informs us, he was only buried with his wife Sarah. And in verse 17 we similarly read that when Ishmael died, he was gathered to his people. And the same language is used of Isaac and Jacob and Aaron and Moses and Josiah, as we've just seen. And in Deuteronomy chapter 31 and verse 16, God tells Moses, "You are going to rest with your fathers," which clearly does not refer to Moses' burial, since we're told in Deuteronomy 34:6 that he was buried in a valley in the land of Moab. So we come down to just two possibilities then. Well, perhaps this expression is just a euphemism for death. I mean, we have our own euphemisms, don't we? We talk about pushing up the daisies or biting the dust. Well, an accountant may act in an ultra-conservative manner, demanding a high degree of verification before making any legal claim to a profit. That's what we call conservative accounting. But I'm not convinced that responsible exegesis requires me to act like a conservative accountant. We might compare this language of being gathered to one's people with an Egyptian prayer to the sun god, which ends like this. I'm just quoting now from this Egyptian prayer. "May you give me old age in your city," the city of the sun god, "my eye beholding your beauty," the beauty of the sun god, "a burial in the west, the place of heart's content, as I join the favoured ones who went in peace," gathering to those ancestors. "May you give me sweet breeze when I land, and garlands on the day of the Wag feast," which is a feast dedicated to the death of the god Osiris, which took place in late August. Anyway, you can see there that the Egyptians had a view of the afterlife, which involved joining the favoured ones who died in peace. Now, we have additionally excellent reasons for believing that our phrase does indeed point to life after death, especially when we interpret this passage canonically, with reference to the entirety of biblical thought in both the Old and especially the New Testaments. Now, I would hesitate to stretch this language of being gathered to one's people or one's fathers as indicating that there's going to be family reunions in the afterlife, and some people do press it that far, but I'm not sure that's wise. But I do think it's reasonable to see it as referring to the reality of the afterlife. And certainly, as we saw when we looked at Genesis 22, when Abraham, in obedience to God, set out to sacrifice Isaac, he spoke, didn't he, in terms of both himself and his son returning. Because, as the book of Hebrews reflects, he reasoned that God could raise the dead, and figuratively speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. And as Jesus points out in Exodus chapter 3 and verse 6, God refers to himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, which Jesus points out implies that he is the God of the living, not of the dead. You read about that in Mark chapter 12. So much for that phrase, the death of Abraham. Now let's think about the burial. Let's look at the burial of Abraham. And there are two major things I think to notice here. First of all, he's buried by Isaac and Ishmael. Now, we must not make the mistake of thinking that Isaac is the only legitimate son of Abraham. Genesis 16 and 21 have shown us that God cares for Hagar and Ishmael. They were not morally blameless, but neither were Abraham and Sarah. Indeed, Hagar and Ishmael became the victims of sins that had been committed by Abraham and Sarah. And while it was necessary for Ishmael to be physically removed from the Abrahamic household, God did not reject Ishmael. And indeed, you remember in chapter 21 and verse 20, we read, God was with the boy, or was with Ishmael, as he grew up. Well, we can't get clearer than that. Isaac was not superior to Ishmael. His greater importance simply consisted in how God was to use him in fulfilling his great mission purpose to bring blessing to the whole world. And in the same way, Israel, though chosen by God, was not superior to other nations or other peoples, which is a point that's made explicitly in the book of Deuteronomy. And again, the greater importance of Israel simply consisted in how God was to use Israel to fulfill his global mission purpose. So if God happens to use us to achieve great ends, let us not for a moment imagine that this means that we are superior to other people. It's just not so. The second key thing to note is where Abraham was buried. His sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah, near Mamre, in the field of Ephron, son of Zohar the Hittite, the field Abraham had bought from the Hittites. And there Abraham was buried with his wife Sarah. That's verses 9 and 10. So the story of Abraham finishes with this glimmer of hope. Abraham's descendants, through Isaac, legitimately own this particular part of Canaan. And in reality, they own the whole of Canaan, for God is the landlord, and he promised it to Abraham and his descendants, so he might provide us with a model of a new humanity, living in a new Garden of Eden. That's what Canaan was supposed to represent. And of course, God is the landlord for the whole earth, and every human being is just a tenant who can be tossed out if they trash the place. And as Jesus' disciples, we are the meek, the ones enjoying God's blessing, which will culminate in us as the new humanity, inheriting the entire earth. And so we come, finally, to the whole emphasis upon blessing. I mean, because the story of Abraham finishes with precisely those words, doesn't it? After Abraham's death, God blessed his son Isaac, who then lived near Beer Lahai. So we're back where we began, in Genesis chapter 12, with God's purpose to channel his blessing to all nations, all peoples, through Abraham and his descendants, beginning with Isaac. So the story of Abraham therefore begins with the Missio Dei, the mission of God, and it ends with the Missio Dei, the mission of God. In the same way that God's blessing on the Abrahamic people aims at bringing blessing to the world, so it is with God's blessing on you and me. May your church, my church, as a church filled with those who experience God's grace in their own lives, be a community through which God brings blessing and eternal life to many others, both here and abroad. Amen.